Texas, late summer 1945. The air carried the dry sweetness of cut hay and the faint metallic scent of the camp fences that had begun to rust. From a distance, Camp Wallace looked like a place caught between seasons. No longer a prison, not yet a home. The guard towers stood empty, their shadows long across the red dirt. Trucks rumbled lazily past the gate, carrying crates labeled medical supplies instead of munitions. In the motor pool, horses whinnied where trucks once lined up for convoys. It was as if the land itself had remembered how to breathe. Sergeant Will Turner leaned against the corral fence, watching the chestnut mare flick her tail at flies. He'd been a horseman before the war, a ranch hand out of Kerr County who could ride before he could read. When the Army brought him back from Europe and assigned him to Camp Wallace as a riding instructor for rehabilitation programs, he thought it was a joke, but orders were orders. Somewhere in a Washington office, someone had decided that teaching men, and now, apparently, women, to ride again was a good way to teach them to live again. He squinted toward the gate. A line of women approached under the late morning sun. White Red Cross armbands bright against khaki sleeves. They walked with the weary precision of people who had lived too long under inspection. Their leader, tall and blonde, carried herself like an officer even without insignia. The guard called out, "German nurses, new arrivals from Fort Sam." Turner exhaled through his teeth. Prisoners, then. Or maybe something less clear. The women stopped at the fence. The tall one spoke first in careful English. "We were told we would help in the infirmary." Her voice was steady, her accent precise. Turner nodded toward the stables. "You will, but you'll help yourselves too, if you can stand the smell." Behind her, a younger nurse whispered something that made the others smile. Turner caught only one word. Freiheit. Freedom. The word hung in the hot air like a question. That evening, the camp commander, Captain Hughes, found Turner in the mess hall. "You're good with horses," Hughes said, lighting a cigarette. "Think you could teach the nurses a thing or two?" Turner looked up from his coffee. "Sir, they're not cavalry." Hughes shrugged. "They're human. The war's over. Maybe they ought to feel something other than fear." Turner tilted his hat back. "You want me to run a riding school for the enemy?" Hughes smiled faintly. "I want you to remind everyone what peace looks like." The next morning, a notice appeared on the board outside the commissary. "Riding demonstration. Volunteers welcome." Turner expected no one. By noon, 8 nurses stood at the fence, sleeves rolled, hair pinned neatly under white kerchiefs. They looked both nervous and determined, like students on the first day of school. Turner mounted his mare, the leather creaking. "Name's Turner," he said. "You treat the animal with respect, she'll give it back. Same as folks." He rode a slow circle, showing them how to hold the reins, how to keep balance through the hips instead of the hands. "A horse knows your heart before your words," he said. "So make sure it's steady." The interpreter repeated his words in German, and the women nodded solemnly. When he dismounted and held out the reins to the tall nurse, she hesitated, then reached out. The mare sniffed her palm, blew softly, and let her stroke its muzzle. The men watching from the barracks muttered, but no one stopped them. By the end of the first lesson, dust rose in golden clouds around the corral. The women took turns mounting, laughing nervously, gripping too tightly, then relaxing as the horses found their rhythm. Turner guided each one by the bridle, patient as stone. When the tall nurse completed a slow lap and slid down, applause rippled from the onlookers. The sound startled her, but she smiled. It was the first time Turner had seen her smile. That evening, she knocked on the stable door holding a folded sketch. She'd drawn the mare in pencil, every line delicate, the shading exact. At the bottom she'd written in German, "Ein anderes Freiheit." A different kind of freedom. Turner looked at the words for a long moment. "You spelled it right," he said quietly. She nodded. "I know. I practiced." Over the next week the lessons continued. The nurses arrived early, sleeves rolled, eyes bright despite the heat. Turner watched them change from timid to sure-footed, learning how to guide the animals, how to trust them. In the afternoons, townspeople gathered by the fence to watch. Children pointed. Ranchers leaned on tailgates. Some came out of curiosity, others out of disbelief. One old man muttered, "Never thought I'd see Germans riding under our flag." His wife hushed him. Maybe that's the point. On the 6th day, a storm rolled in from the Gulf. The sky darkened, the air thick with the smell of rain. Turner shouted for the riders to head for the barn. The wind hit like a freight train, scattering straw, snapping the flags. Lotta, the tall nurse, struggled to steady her mare. Turner ran, caught the reins, and led her inside just as thunder cracked overhead. For a moment, lightning illuminated both of them, an American sergeant and a German nurse holding the same frightened animal between them. They laughed out of relief more than joy. When the storm finally eased, the nurses helped mop the barn floor. Lotta tied her kerchief tighter and said, "In war, rain meant fear. Here, it only means clean." Turner paused mid-swipe. "That's a fine line," he said. She nodded. Fine lines can be bridges. The next morning, the air smelled of wet cedar and saddle oil. The ground steamed under the new sun. Hughes rode out to the corral, cigar between his teeth. "Heard the ladies handled the storm better than some of our men," he said. Turner grinned. "They don't spook easy." Hughes looked over the fence at the nurses brushing the horses. Maybe they shouldn't have to leave so soon. The war's ending everywhere but here. Lotta looked up from her work, hearing the word leave. "We go soon?" she asked Turner. "Orders come," he said. She touched the horse's neck and whispered something he didn't catch. Later he asked the interpreter. The man smiled. She said, "Maybe home is not where you start, but where someone lets you stand still." That evening, after the others had gone, Turner stayed behind to lock the stables. The sky was orange with the last light. Lotta returned, carrying a small lantern. "You left saddle out," she said. He took it from her, their hands brushing for a second. "Nothing improper, just human." "Danke," he said. She blinked, surprised by the German word, then smiled. "You learn fast." When she left, Turner sat on the fence rail, the smell of hay thick around him, the lantern swinging gently in the breeze. He thought about everything that had brought them here. How enemies could become students. How laughter could echo in a place built for silence. He opened his journal and wrote, "Today, the Germans rode horses under a Texas sky. No gunfire, no orders, no hate. Maybe peace isn't signed. Maybe it's saddled." He closed the book, blew out the lantern, and looked once more toward the darkening pasture. The wind carried a faint sound, the soft nickering of horses, and somewhere, laughter in a language that no longer mattered. For the first time in years, the night felt wide open, like a gate swung free. By early September 1945, Camp Wallace no longer felt like a military post. It felt like a crossroads. Every morning, the bugle still played, but instead of marching feet, there were hoofbeats echoing across the red dirt. The corral had become the camp's heartbeat, its rhythm replacing the old one of drills and orders. People from the nearby town of Bay Haven started driving out just to watch the nurses ride. Children perched on the fence rails, clutching lemonade bottles, eyes wide with fascination. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the laughter around the camp didn't sound borrowed. It sounded homegrown. Sergeant Turner noticed the change in himself, too. He used to measure days by chores: feed, brush, saddle, rest. Now he measured them by progress. Who learned to keep her seat? Who dared to canter? Who finally stopped flinching when the mare tossed her head? The nurses had learned quickly. Lotta Keller had become the group's quiet leader, graceful, deliberate. The younger ones followed her example, straight-backed in the saddle, confident enough now to tease each other in broken English. They even started humming along to the cowboy songs from the radio. Not everyone approved. The camp mail clerk, a thin man with too much time, collected complaints sent by townsfolk who thought compassion looked suspicious. "Sergeant fraternizing with enemy aliens," one letter read. Another said, "Teaching them our ways makes us forget theirs." Captain Hughes nailed the letters to the bulletin board beside a handwritten note. "Compassion is not surrender." When Turner saw it, he grinned. "You write that, sir?" Hughes shrugged. "Borrowed it from my chaplain. Figured the message could use a louder wall." For a while, the tension stayed outside the fence. Inside, the lessons grew into something both ordinary and sacred. The women took turns leading the horses, adjusting stirrups for each other, trading German words for English ones. Balance, trust, gentle. Turner pretended not to notice when they tried his accent, mimicking his drawl. One morning, Lotta approached him with a question. "What is difference between free and safe?" she asked. He thought about it, squinting into the sun. "Safe is something the army gives you," he said. "Free is something you give yourself." She repeated it under her breath like a verse she wanted to remember. A week later, during the hottest stretch of the season, an accident nearly ended the program. Ingrid, one of the younger nurses, was riding a restless bay gelding when a flag on the fence tore loose in a gust of wind. The horse reared, hooves flashing. Ingrid fell backward into the dust. Turner dropped the reins of his own horse and ran. By the time he reached her, she was sitting up, blinking through the dirt on her face, laughing in disbelief. "I am fine," she said, waving off the medics. "Horse is more afraid than me." The crowd exhaled all at once. Turner brushed her sleeve. "Next time, we'll pick a flag that stays put." News of the fall traveled quickly through town. That night, the Bay Haven Gazette printed a single line under its local column. German nurse takes tumble, gets up smiling. The next morning, the camp gate was crowded with visitors bringing baskets of biscuits and coffee for the riders. An old rancher leaned on the rail, watching the nurses saddle up again. "Guess they ain't porcelain after all," he said. Turner tipped his hat. "No, sir. They're tougher than barbed wire." That afternoon, Captain Hughes called Turner into his office. "Word's gone up the chain," he said, tapping a folder on his desk. "Command's sending an inspector to evaluate the program." Turner frowned. "Evaluate for what? Teaching decency?" Hughes smirked. "You know how it works. Paperwork chases anything that looks alive." He leaned forward. "You keep those lessons running. Let results speak." The inspector arrived 3 days later. Short, sharp, a colonel with boots polished like mirrors. He didn't smile once during introductions. The nurses lined up, the horses gleaming in the sun. Lotta stepped forward, hands clasped neatly, the picture of composure. Turner guided her into the ring. The colonel folded his arms. "Proceed." The lesson began in silence. Turner gave quiet commands. The interpreter relayed them. The horses trotted in smooth arcs, dust rising in golden halos around their hooves. Then, without being told, the women began to sing softly, an old folk tune from home, the melody slow and aching. Turner didn't understand the words, but he felt them. When the ride ended, the colonel cleared his throat. "I expected a spectacle," he said. "What I saw was discipline." He signed the papers on the rail. "Approved. Continue until repatriation." That evening the barn lights burned late. The women brought a wooden box tied with string. Lotta handed it to Captain Hughes. "We made something," she said. "From broken fence wood." Inside was a small carved horse, smooth and simple, its tail flowing like wind. Beneath it, they'd burned words in 2 languages. "No fence between hearts." Hughes stared at it for a long time before speaking. "That's going on my desk till I die." The next morning the mood in the camp was lighter than ever. Someone brought a camera from town and took a group photograph. Nurses in white, soldiers in denim, horses lined shoulder to shoulder under the Texas sun. In the corner, a boy from the bakery stood holding his father's hat to his chest. It was a picture no one could have imagined a year earlier. A few days later, new orders arrived. The German medical staff would be processed for return to Europe within a month. Turner read the memo twice. It was expected, but it still hit him like a cold wind. When he told the nurses, they didn't speak at first. Finally, Lotta said, "We are grateful. We will remember the dust of Texas." Turner swallowed hard. "Texas'll remember you too." On their last Saturday, they requested one final ride. Turner agreed. The morning dawned clear, the air carrying the first hint of autumn. The camp gates were open, and the townspeople lined both sides of the road. As the riders passed, hats lifted, children waved, and someone began to clap. Lotta turned her horse and called back to Turner. "This is freedom, yes?" He grinned. "The only kind that counts." They rode past the outer fence and onto the open pasture, where wildflowers had returned after years of neglect. The wind pulled at their uniforms, tangled their hair, filled the empty spaces between them with something lighter than forgiveness, something closer to grace. By noon, the riders turned back toward the camp, dust trailing behind them like a banner. At the gate, Captain Hughes waited with a salute. Lotta dismounted and handed Turner the reins. "When we go," she said, "the horses will forget us?" He shook his head. "Not a chance. Horses remember the ones who ride gentle." She smiled faintly, adjusting the Red Cross band on her sleeve. "Then perhaps they will remember mercy too." The last photograph of that day shows her standing beside Turner, both smiling, both squinting into the Texas sun. Behind them, the fence they'd once feared looked smaller than it ever had before. That night, after the camp went quiet, Turner walked out to the corral alone. The horses shifted softly in their stalls. He leaned on the gate, listening to the steady rhythm of their breathing. He thought about what she'd said, how mercy could outlast memory. The stars came out one by one, and for the first time in years, he felt the sky didn't belong to one side or the other. It simply belonged to anyone brave enough to look up. Winter settled softly over Texas in 1946, the kind of winter that smelled of cedar smoke and rain instead of snow. The last of the transport trucks had rolled away from Camp Wallace weeks earlier, carrying the German nurses south to the port at Galveston and then east across the Atlantic. Only a few soldiers remained to dismantle the barracks and repurpose the hospital for veterans. The fences had been cut down, the towers empty. The wind moved freely where barbed wire once caught it. Sergeant Will Turner stayed behind as caretaker. He said it was for the horses, but anyone who knew him understood better. Every morning, he saddled the same chestnut mare that Lotta had favored. circling the quiet corral as though rehearsing a memory. The mare still perked her ears at the sound of boots approaching the gate. Sometimes, when the sun was just right, Turner could almost imagine the nurses returning. White sleeves catching the light, their laughter rising with the dust. In February, a letter arrived bearing a German postmark and handwriting he recognized immediately. It began, "Dear Sergeant Turner, we are home. The hospital in Bremen stands again. It is small, but it breathes. We ride borrowed horses now in the countryside to keep our balance and remember your lessons. If you ever see a horse running free, think of us. Yours, Lotta Keller." Turner read it 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it into his breast pocket. That night, he poured himself coffee in the empty mess hall and set the cup across from him, as if she might walk through the door. "If you ever see a horse running free," he murmured aloud, "guess I'll have to keep looking." By spring, the Army decommissioned Camp Wallace altogether. The land went to the county, which turned the open fields into a rehabilitation ranch for wounded veterans. Turner was offered the job of supervisor, and he accepted without hesitation. He repainted the old corral fence white and built new stables using leftover lumber from the barracks. The first group of patients arrived that May. Men with missing limbs, hollow eyes, and too much silence between them. Turner started them with the basics, the same way he'd started the nurses. "Don't think about staying on," he told them. "Think about learning to trust what carries you." The horses responded the way they always did, with patience that made men forget pride. Some mornings he'd find a veteran sitting quietly in the saddle, tears streaking dust on his face. No one said much about it. The horses understood. That summer, Turner got another letter, this time from the American Red Cross. They were arranging a goodwill exchange between former Allied and Axis medical staff to share hospital reconstruction methods. The delegation from Germany would tour several U.S. facilities. The name at the bottom made him freeze halfway through reading. Head nurse Lotta Keller, she arrived in Galveston on a clear morning in June 1949. Turner drove down in his old Army Jeep, waiting at the dock while the ship's horn echoed across the harbor. When the passengers finally descended the gangway, he saw her instantly. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with pale gold from the sun, her uniform replaced by a simple blue dress with a Red Cross pin at the collar. She carried herself with the same calm authority as before. When she spotted him, she smiled in disbelief. "Still cowboy?" she asked. He laughed. "Still nurse?" They drove north to Bay Haven with the windows down, the warm wind full of salt and dust. She asked about the horses, about Captain Hughes, about the camp. He told her how the grounds had become a veterans' ranch, how children from the town came on weekends to learn to ride. "Same corral," he said, "just different hearts inside it." She looked out the window, eyes bright. "You kept freedom alive," she said. The next day, Turner invited her to the ranch. Veterans leaned on crutches along the fence line as Lotta walked toward the horses. The chestnut mare, older now, slower, lifted her head and gave a low nicker. Lotta laughed softly. "She remembers," she whispered. "I told you she would." Turner handed her the reins. "Still remember how to ride?" he asked. She looked at him, half teasing. "You forget who taught me?" She swung into the saddle with the same steady grace as before. The veterans cheered. She rode once around the ring, the wind catching the hem of her dress. Turner watched her silhouette move against the morning light and thought how peace, like balance, was something learned again each day. That evening, the town held a small gathering in the refurbished mess hall. The mayor gave a short speech about reconciliation and courage, about the miracle of forgiveness that had taken root in Bay Haven. He gestured toward Lotta and Turner standing together by the old carved horse the nurses had given years ago. "This started as a camp," the mayor said, "and became a lesson. They showed us that fences don't end wars. Hearts do." Lotta stepped forward to speak. Her English had grown fluent, her voice steady. "When we came here, we were afraid. We expected punishment. Instead, we found people who showed mercy without asking what side we came from. I tell my patients in Germany that America taught me the hardest medicine: kindness." Applause filled the room, soft at first, then louder, spreading like warmth through the crowd. Turner clapped with the rest, but his eyes never left hers. Later that night, after the visitors had gone, they walked to the edge of the pasture where the horses grazed under a wide, star-pinned sky. The air was cool and alive with crickets. Lotta leaned on the fence rail, her hands folded loosely. "When I was prisoner, I used to look at the stars through wire," she said. "They looked small. Here they look near." Turner nodded. "Maybe that's the difference between fences and freedom," she smiled, "and between surviving and living." They stood in silence for a long time, the quiet hum of the field filling the space between them. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I made this," she said. Inside was a wooden carving of a horse, its mane curved like wind. "Made from fence posts," she added, "to remember what fences can become." Turner ran a finger along the smooth grain. "You've got a talent for turning barbed wire into poetry," he said. She looked out toward the horizon. Maybe that's what healing really is. When she left the next morning, he drove her back to the train station. Neither of them spoke much. Words felt too heavy for what had already been said. As the train pulled away, she leaned from the window and called, "Don't forget to look for horses running free." He waved until the car vanished into the shimmer of heat over the tracks. Years passed. The ranch grew, adding new barns, a small chapel, and a white arch over the entrance carved with the same phrase the nurses had burned years before. "No fence between hearts." Visitors came from across the state to see where the war's enemies had learned to ride together. Above the main gate hung a brass plaque, a different kind of freedom. In 1945, Texan Horsemen invited German nurses to ride, and the world learned that peace can be taught. Every spring, Turner led the first ride of the season, children laughing, flags fluttering side by side in the wind. When the chestnut mare's great-granddaughter trotted past the fence, he sometimes thought he heard faint echoes of that old laughter. Half German, half Texan, entirely human. He never stopped looking for horses running free, and whenever he found them, on the ridge at sunrise or galloping through the open fields, he'd tip his hat toward the horizon and whisper, "I see you, Lotta."